Hello friends, today's topic of discussion is Hindi films and the dramas of William Shakespeare. William Shakespeare is one of the most important playwrights, one who wrote a number of plays and dramas in the context of the English literature, and he was very popular as well. And when we tend to understand the kind of dramas which were written by him and how these dramas they were being adapted by some of the Hindi filmmakers, that how they made films on the dramas which were written by Shakespeare, how the themes of Shakespeare they were very popular in many of the Hindi films. But before that, we'll also have to see the kind of background in the context of the colonial rule, that we find that how English as a language was introduced in India through the Macaulay's Minute on Education and the Governor General's resolution. And when English was introduced in India, we find that how it was also being taught in the Indian universities. And when English literature became one of the important components of the curriculum of English in India, we find that William Shakespeare's plays or dramas they were also being taught here. In this context, we find that over a period of time, many of his dramas they became very popular. A number of films also they were being made. The kind of themes with which William Shakespeare's dramas they were associated, those kinds of themes they were also being in a way inspired in a number of filmmakers, and these filmmakers we find that they were trying to in a way understand. As you can see on the screen as well, these are some of the references which one can in a way see that how some of the Indian academicians they have tried to dabble in this kind of a theme. They have tried to understand that how William Shakespeare's plays they were an inspiration for some of the Hindi films, and we find that when English was being taught, it was not only being taught in the classrooms, and how Hamlet and Richard II they were early performances of such kind of plays of Shakespeare. They were also being done on the East India Company ships in 1907, and how the European theatres they were also performing these kinds of performances we find in 1775 and 1776 in Calcutta and Bombay respectively. And we also see that when we tend to understand that how the ideas of Shakespeare or the plays of Shakespeare, indigenization was also being done, and how the Indian people, those who were associated with literature, they were also trying to adapt these kinds of plays. And we find that the first Bengali version of The Merchant of Venice appeared in 1852, and the Gujarati audiences they witnessed The Taming of the Shrew in the same year at Surat as well. And we see that how Shakespeare was continuously reimagined in the Indian framework, how he was being adapted in the Indian framework. And when you talk about the Indian cinema, we find that how from the initial times, because India was under the colonial rule initially when cinema came into existence, and it remained so till 1947 when British they left India, or rather they were being forced to leave India. And we find that how some kind of a nexus between the Indian cinema and the European drama, it becomes clear when we look back at the origins of celluloid in India. And when you talk about those early years, it was also often impossible to stage a complete drama, whether a tragedy or a comedy. So some of the selected portions from the plays, including Shakespeare, they were also being performed. And we find that when you are trying to connect these kinds of elements, scenes, for example, some other elements, they were also being used like farce, music, and some kind of entertaining interludes, they were also being introduced. And we see that how when audiences they were watching these kinds of dramas or plays, they were inclined towards action and gesticulation than lengthy dialogues, and they preferred an abundance of songs, energetic dancing, clowning, and spectacles. and they in a way especially enjoyed the supernatural scenes, and they also expected a touch of romance even in the serious narratives. And interestingly, this kind of a theatrical condition was not unique to India. It was resembling the popular expectations of audiences, or Shakespeare's audiences in that sense, in England as well. And when you talk about the Indian film directors, many a times we find that not everyone acknowledged this kind of a debt to Shakespeare, and there were others, those who acknowledged this kind of a debt. They also in a way wrote also in the film titles that they have borrowed the kind of a script or idea from Shakespeare. And Vishal Bhardwaj is one of the filmmakers who has in a way acknowledged this kind of a debt to William Shakespeare, and how he in a way adapted three films from the popular Shakespearean plays Macbeth based and Othello and Hamlet. These were the three kind of important sources in the framework of Shakespeare, where we find that how these important plays of Shakespeare, they were in a way adapted by Vishal Bharadwaj. And on Macbeth he made Makbul, on Othello he made Onkara, and on Hamlet he made Heather. So these kinds of films they were being made by him. And we also see that how when you talk about the film adaptations and these kinds of adaptations which have been done, then it also needs some kind of a change in the context of the kind of a culture to which they belong. And adaptations cannot be some kind of a direct translation in that sense. Some kind of a changes in adaptations they will definitely come, and how these kind of adaptations they are going to also in a way enrich the kind of existing literature which is already available. And so the question of fidelity is another important concern which is there, and that how closely an adaptation adheres to the original, and it was often at the heart of such kind of a skepticism which we find. So this kind of a discourse on fidelity is also an important concern, whether the kind of adaptation which has been done, whether it adheres to the original, or the kind of changes, any kind of changes which have been made in the original play or drama, or the thing which has been borrowed from. And when we talk about the initial Indian cinema, we find that how Indian cinema was also engaged in some kind of an adaptation from the quite early times. When we talk about Raja Harishchandra, which was the first considered to be the first feature film of India, and how it was the story was also in a way borrowed from the scriptures or religious texts of India. And when you talk about the talkies, for example, the films which were conveying through dialogues, and the first talkie Alamara, which came in 1931, which was directed by Ardeshi Irani, it paved the way for cinema as a narrative art form that could combine the multiple traditions. So we find that initially there was some kind of a criticism about some kind of an anxiety which was there about the question of fidelity, and adaptation studies, they have in a way emerged as a prolific area of research both in India and globally. So in this sense, when we tend to understand that how the adaptation they have definitely played an important role in terms of cross cultural influences, in terms of understanding other cultures, and when we tend to adapt them from the point of view of our own cultures, then we are also in a way borrowing from other cultures, we are also in a way trying to communicate some of the ideas of other cultures. So that is an important concern. And when we talk about the Indian cinema, initially we find that how Parsi theatre was the locus of immense theatrical activity during this time, and played an important role in preparing the audiences for the Shakespeare's narratives on the stage and later on the screen as well. So, when you talk about the contribution of the Parsi theatre, the kind of hybridity which it had, its eclectic mix of the Western dramaturgy and the Indian aesthetic traditions, and how it acted as a cultural bridge as well. So, initially we find that how Parsi theatre was influencing Indian cinema, and some of the conventions of the Parsi theatre, they were integral to the Indian films. And when we talk about the scholars, those who have in a way tried to understand cinema, that how it was in a way hybrid as well, and Catherine Hansen has talked about the synthesized elements of the Asian and the European origin, lending it a hybrid middle-brow character. And when you talk about this performative hybridity, not only popularized the Western stories but also made them accessible across the Indian audiences by embedding them in local idioms of music, spectacles, and melodrama. And the others scholars, those who have in a way tried to in a way approach the question of adaptation, and theorists like Linda Hutcheon, Gordon E. Sluthag, and Robert Stem, and Esilda Renego, they have in a way argued strongly in the favor of the significance of adaptation. And we find that how Hutcheon has talked about and emphasized that adaptations should be understood as the reinterpretations and recreations rather than mere copies. And it is also very important in the context that how they cannot be copied in a particular culture, because we see that when they are being adapted, when they are being rewritten from the point of view of that particular culture, then they totally will have a different kind of a flavor, though they may be adapted from them, but at the same time they will not be the copies of that particular text in that way. And when you talk about the Indian scenario, we find that how the plays of Shakespeare, they were not in a way replicated word by word, but rather they were reimagined within the indigenous cultural frameworks, infused with the music, dance, and local social realities. So, we find that how scholars like Slethog, they have emphasized that adaptation transforms not only text but also cultures as they shift across media and geography. And this kind of a categorization where adaptation strategies into faithfulness oblique fidelity, where we find that how they are close to the original part, and how supplementation and surplus in the framework of adding new layers of interpretation, and also free play in a way taking creative liberties to generate fresh meaning. So, we find that how these kinds of adaptation strategies, they are also very important, and how they are definitely playing an important part in terms of understanding. Then we see that when you talk about these approaches, they also in a way resonate with the Indian experience, where cinema has been the most powerful tool of storytelling, reaching the audience across class, caste, and regional divides. And when you talk about the Western stories and how they were being introduced in the Indian performance art to foster the cultural harmony and experiment with narrative and aesthetic form. So, when we talk about these kinds of stories or ideas which have been in a way taken, and how these kinds of stories and ideas, they play an important role in terms of culture as well, where we find that when you are borrowing from other cultures, so we are not only borrowing ideas, but at the same time a lot of symbolisms or symbols of that particular culture, they are also being borrowed from them. And when we talk about cinema, we find that there are certain themes which are considered to be universal in nature, and how cinema across the world is being made on these kinds of themes, where we find that love, betrayal, ambition, and fate, that how they proved during this time to be an ideal figure for this intellectual and cultural exchange. And Shakespeare was writing in that particular vein, where he was writing about love in the framework of Romeo and Juliet, and how this particular drama of Romeo and Juliet of Shakespeare, it was borrowed consistently by so many filmmakers, not only in India but abroad as well, because we find that these kinds of emotions are very natural to the audience that way, and how the audience in a way reacted, responded to such kind of emotions. And when you talk about Shakespeare, we find that when he was writing about love, and he was also talking about the issues of the family feud between the lovers of the two families. So such kind of things, they were also being shown on the Indian screen time and again, and how Indian filmmakers, they were borrowing from Shakespeare in terms of making such kind of films. And we see that how the Gujarati language productions of The Taming of the Shrew, The Merchant of Venice, Two Gentlemen of Verona, and The Timon of Athens, they were staged as early as the late 1850s, and demonstrating an early penchant for Shakespeare among Parsi theatre enthusiasts. So in that sense, we find that when we were talking about these kinds of plays, then these kinds of productions, they were also not only happening in Hindi, but we find that they were also happening in other regional languages as well. And before the arrival of cinema, we find from the point of view of theatre, these kinds of production, they were also happening in the field of theatre. And when you talk about Shakespeare, that how over a period of time Shakespearean dramas, they were some kind of acculturation of these kinds of dramas into Indian popular culture, and how it laid the foundation for his eventual integration into Indian cinema, where we find the stories of Shakespeare, they reached mass audiences on an unprecedented scale. So when these kinds of stories by or dramas by Shakespeare, they were being made into films, then we find that how Indian audiences, they also came to know about these kinds of literary writings. And it was not only true of Shakespearean dramas or plays. We find that so many Indian stories like Devdas, for example, how it became popular during the course, we find where during the colonial period, that how Devdas was made in Bengali and Hindi both in 1930s, and thereafter it was also made in 1955, and then again in 2000, and with some kind of a new version in the framework of Devdi later. So we find that how even from the original story point of view, the original story remained intact, but at the same time some kind of a changes, they were being made time and again in this kind of a story, when it was made in 30s and 50s, and thereafter in 2000 when it was again remade. So this kind of a change was also necessary from the point of view, or from the point of view of the kind of changes which came in the Indian society, that how the society of 1930s and 50s was completely different from the society of 2000. So from that point of view also, we find that these kinds of changes, they were also being made within that particular society. And when you are borrowing from some other society, so it was very important that these changes be made, and these kinds of changes in a way indigenized the kind of production. And we find that how when you talk about the cinematic adaptations and how they were being borrowed from Shakespeare, we find that film industry was in a way trying to, in a way, borrowing from these kinds of ideas. And we find that how his plays, they were introduced in India to promote the English language as well, because in 1830s we definitely see that how English was in a way introduced as a language of instruction in 1835 and thereafter. And so many English medium schools, they were also being established in India. And we also see that many of the Indians, they were also studying in these schools because they were seeing it as a language of mobility, as a language of communication, and how it was also in a way trying to guarantee them as some kind of a job during that time. And we see that when you talk about Indian cinema, how the film adaptations of Shakespeare, they span from the silent era to the contemporary period. And when we see that how filmmakers, they were trying to interpret the plays of Shakespeare in their own way, how the local cultural idiom and social context, they were being integrated, and how films, they were being crafted that in a way resonated directly with the Indian audiences while remaining the structural essence of the original. So, we find that these kinds of adaptations which were being made during this time, they also wanted to keep the original flavor intact, that how the sense of the original is being in a way kept intact, and at the same time the kind of changes which were required to in a way indigenize the production in that particular country, in this case particularly India, where the plays of Shakespeare, they were being indigenized. So, that was also being done during this particular period of time. So, we find that it was also very important due to the fact that how India during this time was under the colonial rule, and English over a period of time evolved in India as a second language, a language that prospered in its indigenized version, and how it in a way linked India to other countries of the world. And when you talk about that how India was being linked through English to the world, it does not mean that it was very essential, because from the point of view of that particular period, it happened rather we see because India was under the colonial rule, and it was not imperative as well, because many of the countries of the world where English is not spoken, they are following their own indigenous language, and they are quite developed as well. So, this idea of development which has been talked about by some of the scholars, that how development came to India because English was introduced in India, how modernization or the modern equipments they also came to India, because how British, they were trying to bring all these kinds of things, but they in a way failed to realize that how British, they exploited the Indians, how so much wealth from India went out because of the various British policies, how Indians, they were being not treated as human beings by the British, the kind of violence, the kind of subjugation to all the Indians during that particular period. So, we see that how when these kinds of ideas, they are being talked about, that how English as a language was prospering in India, but we also have to realize that Indians, they did not have much option at that point of time. They had to in a way accept that language, they had to accept the colonial masters, the way they were being treated, they did not have much option. And when they tried to exercise that kind of an option, when they started to protest and revolt, then we find that various phases of the national movement, they came to the picture, and over a period of time British also realized that they have to go out of India. But from the point of view of culture, we find that when they in a way introduced such kind of changes in English in the Indian education system, where English was being introduced, new kind of a curriculum was being introduced, which was borrowing heavily from the British traditions, then it was very natural for the Indians as well that they are also going to be affected. And when we talk of the Shakespearean works, we find that how these kinds of work, initially for that matter, how the Parsi theatre was trying to translate them in their own way. So, we will continue with our next lecture on this theme. Thank you very much.